This is the Awkward GM Corbin, and today we are covering Hunter the Vigil. I want to get this information as accurately as possible to save your hunters from being destroyed by all manner of monster. Trying something a little bit different here. I've got my flannel shirt, I've got my cowboy hat, and we are all set to go. I also have a terrible accent that I am trying to portray, and it is probably not going to last very long. Many thanks to the hunters that put together this book and put their lives at risk in order to get it into our hands. What differentiates a hunter from a normal mortal? The main thing, they use the same rules as mortals, but the main thing is that hunters get professional training for free. They also, if they are a tier 2 or tier 3 hunter, they are going to get access to status in either their compact or their conspiracy. And if you didn't see it, down here in the fine print, you get an extra 3 starting experience to start off with. That is to try and put you on par with the supernatural creatures that you are going to be hunting. As you can see here, the number of merits you start with as a hunter are only 7, plus the bonus ones that I talked about earlier. And so getting that 3 XP means you can bump your merits up to 10, just like a mummy or any of the other supernatural creatures that you might be facing. Now, since there's not a lot to talk about as way of special abilities that hunters get, what I'm going to talk to you about is how to kill monsters. If you're using the generic monster rules against your players, these are just the stats that you'll get. You'll get access to more drug powers as you go forward and merits and so forth. But if you look at the list here, about potency 1 to 3 is within a human level of skills, attributes, and merits. However, they do get access to dread powers, which makes them much more fierce. The hat is giving me the southern drawl. The rules for these monsters can represent anything from your vampires, werewolves, even to mages to a certain extent. You may have to adjust for it. These aren't your typical werewolves, vampires, mages, etc. They're not going to be using the same rules as you might find in the Mage Awakening books or such. I remember specifically, if you looked at the Demon the Descent book, originally it would say something along the lines of you could use, actually it was the Storyteller's Guide for Demon the Descent, it said you could use embeds and exploits to represent changelings, vampires, etc. And here are some rules that you can use to modify to put them into this rule set. And for now, Hunter the Vigil, we've got these rules for the generic monsters, which are a step up, I think, from the ones that are in the core Chronicles of Darkness book. And so now it seems like my camera is randomly adjusting to different saturations and brightness levels, so I'm going to just go turn on the lights. There we go. I'm very glad that we have these generic monster rules because it really gives you a lot more to work with. Even has optional rules for giving your monster a ban or bane, as well as different rules for the size of the creature and how to modify their speed and so forth. Typically, a hunter is not going to know the potency of the monster they're facing. They're also not going to know the ban or bane unless they do some research. A prepared hunter is a safe hunter, or one hunter that is not going to die as frequently. Hunters should have the nickname the 20-minuters, just to give that sense of hunters only live to be about 20 minutes long when they go on a mission. Not to say that hunters are a weak game line by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that it would give your players a sense of accomplishment that they were able to survive the first mission if you emphasize the deadliness that hunters have to face on a daily basis. Please let me know in the messages below if you've had a hunter die in one of your games, or if you've had a situation where you were a player and your character died. With these being the generic monster rules, you're not going to find a silver bullet that's going to save you. Unless, of course, the GM decides to give the werewolf monster a silver bullet bane. this is something that I should emphasize. There is not just one vampire, one werewolf, one mage. There are multiple, there are a slew of different types of supernatural creatures out there that look and act similar to other types of creatures. For instance, the vampires have the Strix, which are life force draining vampires that behave completely different than the normal vampires from Vampire the Requiem. Similarly, werewolves from Werewolf the Forsaken behave completely different than the gangrel or the beastkin changelings, and so forth. There's some basic tools and tactics that you need to know in order to become a successful hunter. Page 186 is going to cover a lot of what you're going to need to know, which is, for instance, right now, this is how you would find out about the ban or bane of the enemy you're facing. In the core rule book of Chronicles of Darkness, there's a merit called Esoteric Armory, and it's on page 139 of the book, which means it's actually an optional rule. It's not a merit that you could normally take. The reason I say this is because it's in the antagonist section of the book and not in the merit section of the book. Now, ask your storyteller if you can use this, because in my opinion, Esoteric Armory can derail campaigns very quickly, especially if it's something like your players are going up against a rank 5 entity, find out what bane it has, and instead of going through this long mission to try and recover the bane from, say, like an organization or conspiracy that is holding it, instead the players just happen to have it in their backpack or in their house. And it's sort of like is weird because you have this situation where you need the Holy Grail to kill this particular monster, and it just so happens that you have the Holy Grail propping up your bookcase or something like that. I don't know. You might be asking me right now, Corbin, how do your players know that this creature has bans and banes or weaknesses? This creature just came into an existence in my game like 2 sessions ago, and there's no way that there's going to be occult documentation on this creature. Well, for instance, there are a lot of supernatural merited individuals who probably have had dreams and recorded them about certain creatures that may or may not exist in the past or in the future. So if, for instance, your players are dealing with a creature like a God Machine Angel, which was just created recently, there's definitely probably been a stigmatic who had some crazy dream and wrote it down somewhere. Maybe it's only in a first edition copy of some book that got discontinued or is now out of print, or maybe it is on some weblog that someone has that they write all this stuff down on. You could say, oh, but Corbin, the God Machine or the Exarchs or whatever are probably going to stop that from getting out because they don't want people to know about it. And I'll say to you, if someone looks insane, it's easier to probably just leave it out there for public consumption than it is to remove it and then have people start questioning why it was removed. And of course, there's stuff that's going to fall through the cracks. The God Machine might be like, okay, this angel I just created is all powerful, but its weakness is this. Well, someone's writing about this creature that sounds very similar, but it's not exactly right. It has a lot of mistakes in there, and it's actually more beneficial to have people read this and see the mistakes and be caught off guard than it is for them to than it would be if they got just like everything correct. So the players as hunters need to filter out that information, and generally in this research paragraph, the rule is simple. It's intelligence plus occult, and then these result in clues for gathering based on the investigation system, which if you'd like to find out more about the investigation system, I have a video on that on my channel. I'll put it in the messages below. Now, normally, if I were to say, okay, we're going to be facing spirits or ghosts in a session, my players are going to be like, spirits and ghosts? That's going to be impossible because we don't have abilities that can hurt them. Well, there are actually rules for performing exorcisms and summonings, and those are here in the book as well, as you can see. And mainly, it's going to be an extended series of research actions and to narrow down the requirements for a right to try and bring about an ephemeral entity to summon it or to exercise it. What it says here is essentially that you're going to be manifesting conditions that will be affecting the target. Now these could be things like materialize or remove materialize, put it back into its twilight form, fetter, unfetter, and so forth. But you could also probably argue that this could be used to sort of send one of these beings through a specific gate or something like that. So the gate to the shadow or gate to the underworld, essentially. Does this trivialize spirits and ghosts and angels and such for mortals? No, because those creatures are still going to fight you to make sure that they don't go back to where they came from. They want to stay where they are and do what they're doing. So as hunters, you're going to have to try and protect yourselves and stop them from interfering with the ritual. Now, if you do want to actually fight a spirit or a ghost or some sort of supernatural entity that you can't normally face, there's something called abjuration. Abjuration is essentially you're concentrating enough so that you're be able to influence these creatures, to punch them in the face, as it were. So what abjuration is essentially you are using a mantra, meditation, something that is empowered by your soul, essentially, to force the entity away, usually causing it to go back into twilight or be ineffective within an area. The rules for it are essentially like you're using some sort of meditation, maybe you're using a mantra, like the example in the book is a soldier that is attempting to abjure a ghost by reciting a patriotic oath for his country. The abjuration itself is a resolve plus composure roll versus the entity's power plus resist stat. And if you are using your virtue as part of this mantra or meditation, you get a +2 bonus to the dice pool. Also, if your integrity is really high, you're going to get bonuses. If it's very low, you're not going to get bonuses. You're going to get penalties instead. Additionally, if you're successful, what that means is the entity is going to be have all their conditions suppressed for 1 day within the range of the abjurist's willpower in yards, and on an exceptional success, your abjurist is going to become an extra bane for that entity, which means your abjurist could actually punch out this spirit or ghost and do aggravated damage to them because they're super powerful. And if you know the rules for ephemeral entities, if you do aggravated damage to them, that is going to reduce the amount of essence they have, which is another way of killing the entity, because you want to kill them when they have no essence left so that they can't reform. Is your hunter going to know all that? Probably not. That's a lot of metagaming knowledge about the essence and aggravated damage stuff, but they're gonna know they're doing a lot of damage to the creatures, so it's kind of a little bit in-game knowledge as well as out-of-game knowledge, so I might allow it for my players. Lastly, one of the more generic ways that a hunter can deal with monsters and ephemeral entities are setting up wards and bindings. This is essentially going to keep the entity from being able to enter an area, which is pretty potent, especially if you're trying to protect someone. Now, I say this quite often, but your monster's objective is probably not to kill the hunters, unless the hunters are actively trying to kill it, and it knows it can die from that. What I think a monster might be doing is might be trying to perform some sort of ritual itself, or try and target a specific individual, and your hunters have to stop that. For instance, a demon might not be trying to kill someone. They might be trying to get them to sign a contract, and in doing that, give them their soul. And the hunters lose when the demon is able to get that person to sign that contract. Let's delve away from the generic monsters now and talk a little bit about tainted places. Tainted places are essentially your haunted houses or your haunted areas that hunters are going to have to try to either cleanse or make sure people aren't able to access. Now, these tainted places aren't usually sentient. Some of them are, but most of them are inanimate, essentially. What that means is they don't have a consciousness to activate their dread powers. Instead, there are some triggers or rituals or something that might activate these powers. So an example might be if blood is spilt on the ground, activates some sort of telekinesis that attacks the individual or something like that. Maybe there's some quicksand thing that activates when someone begins to cry as their depression causes them to sink through the floor. These are all dread powers that a tainted place might have. Now, all these tainted places behave differently and may have been created in different ways. It could be that it is an ancient burial ground, or it could be that one of these places was the site of a massacre. And it doesn't have to be ghosts that are causing this tainted place to be tainted. It could be any number of tragic reasons. But the players might not be able to just burn down the building or burn the area down in order to cleanse it. Maybe they have to find someone who is of the same nationality or ethnicity as the original people who live there in order to sort of cleanse it of this taintedness. Maybe they have to find a way of getting it out of the hands of some landowner who owns it and into the right hands of people who can take care of it. Now, there doesn't have to be just one way of cleansing an area. It could be that this one area could be cleansed if you burn down the entire forest. Or it could be that there's some sort of artifact or relic from the person who originally died there that you need to bring back in order to cleanse the area of its taintedness. Or it could be that you need to find the person who was like their descendant and bring them there in order to pacify the area. There's so many different options, and it's up to the players to find out which one best fits them or which one they'd rather go with. Maybe your players are looking for the quick and easy route, and so they burn down this entire oak forest. One thing I think of is, what if the hunters wanted to keep one of these tainted places still around, and they utilize the triggers of it to make sure that supernatural creatures that they capture aren't harming anyone else. So for instance, maybe they capture a vampire and they bring it to this tainted place that's a prison, toss that person into a cell, and suddenly that vampire is stuck there, cannot leave. Their abilities aren't working because the tainted place is sort of draining them of their essence, their ability to use their powers. Disclaimer here, essentially a lot of the other game lines that Chronicles of Darkness covers are essentially about being a human while being a monster. And so there's a lot of stuff in there, like for Vampire the Requiem, they have the tenets of a princedom, which basically say, like, don't let people know that you're a vampire, maintain the masquerade and all that such stuff. And so when I say vampires in this regard, or when I say any other supernatural creature in this regard, I'm not saying that this is a supernatural creature that is adhering to all of these like rules to stay alive and to stay unhunted. I'm saying this is either a specific individual or group of individuals who are going against the grain, who may be acting not in the best interest as the group as a whole. So if I'm saying, oh, there's this mage that is taking control of this section of a town or something like that and has created a cult for these people to worship them, I'm not saying that, oh, this mage is part of the concilium, they'd be protected, and if you kill this mage, suddenly the entire concilium is after them. No, what I'm saying is that in this specific scenario, there's an outlier that the hunters have tracked down and found. If you want to place something different in your game, go right ahead. I'm just sort of presenting this in this way so that you can I can show you why hunters are scary for other supernatural creatures. This is something that I like in Chronicles of Darkness. It localizes the threats to a specific location and doesn't usually spread them out in a global conspiracy fashion, such as in other game systems where if you're trying to do something, don't even bother trying to hide it because there's an overarching conspiracy that's going to know everything that you're doing at all times, so why even bother? Even an entity like the God Machine that is shown to be all-powerful and all-knowing is dependent on infrastructure in order to maintain that facade. And if infrastructure is starting to be deteriorated away either by the player characters or by demons off camera, the God Machine isn't going to be able to just smite random people whenever it wants. It's got to have infrastructure to do it and angels to carry it out, or stigmatics and dupes to maintain it. With Vampire the Requiem, the prince might have a bunch of agents across the city, but stuff's gonna fall through the cracks. Maybe they're paying attention to some other threat while another minor threat is being overlooked. A lot of what Chronicles of Darkness is about are these monsters still being human or trying to keep their humanity, and humans are fallible. And so your antagonists should also be fallible, especially if you want your hunter players to feel like they're overcoming a challenge. So let's cover vampires here. Vampires are a pretty common enemy for one to face. Essentially, they're parasites upon humanity where they can infect others and turn them into vampires, or infect others and turn them into what are known as ghouls or thralls. Now, if you're a hunter, never get near any vampire blood. Normally, when you're fighting a vampire, they're not going to bleed, but sometimes they'll force blood out of themselves in order to get some on you or in your mouth or something, so that they can use that power of their blood to bind them to them. It might be very beneficial for you to use personal protective equipment, PPE, and treat all blood as if it's infected. If you have ever had to take any sort of safety training in the workplace that involves blood, you might be hearing a lot of things right now that you're familiar with. So what's going to kill a vampire? Garlic, silver, holy water? Well, that might work for some vampires. It is known that some specific vampires may have these sort of bans or banes. But specifically, staking a vampire through the heart isn't going to kill them, but it will paralyze them and make them look dead. So be sure to double check that they're actually dead when you do something like that. Now, if you're going to face a vampire, you're going to want to have fire. Incendiary rounds, crossbows with fire tips, or something of the sort. Additionally, sunlight is going to be very potent against them. So how are you going to use the tactics that a hunter has in order to kill a vampire in these many ways? You're at the controlled immolation tactic. This is one of my favorite tactics that hunters can utilize. Essentially, what this is that the primary actor of this tactic, the person who's putting the most effort into it, is going to set the monster on fire. Meanwhile, everyone else who's helping is going to ensure that the monster doesn't escape. This is useful for vampires and any other creatures that are weak to fire, such as Prometheans and mummies. Tactics work similar to a teamwork role. However, the primary actor, is going to have to risk a willpower point, not a dot, a point, so it will recover eventually in order to get the outcome to happen. Using those two as examples, this sort of gives the hint that most undead creatures are weak to fire, though that might not always be the case depending on your storyteller. Now, if you're reading this dice pool and you're wondering what it means, essentially you're going to have your primary actor roll stamina plus firearms or athletics versus the stamina plus athletics plus potency or rank of the monster. And then everyone else who's helping you make sure that the monster is not escaping is going to roll either a wits plus weaponry or brawl to contain the monster, or a wits plus survival or science to contain the fire. This way that the fire doesn't extend out and start burning people or buildings nearby, and that the monster stays within range of being set on fire. Now, the backslash, like 1/4 means that you can have between 1 person and 4 people doing this action. If you have more than that, their successes can't be used to help. So this is considered a teamwork action, which means the primary actor's role is going to be benefited from the secondary actor's roles. So those people containing the creature and containing the fire, their successes are going to be added to the successes of the primary actor. Sometimes there isn't a dice pool for this role, so instead it's just going to have an ND there which says no dice, and that just means it's going to have a benefit other than giving dice to the dice pool. So how might you trap a vampire? How might you get their attention? Well, you can set out a lure, which is essentially a hunter who is going to try and lure out the monster. Normally, this is considered a physical tactic, but I believe it could be used as a social tactic as well, such as putting a handsome man into a nightclub and hoping that he is able to attract a vampire who wants to suck his blood. Now, be sure to check that that person that is being lured in is actually a vampire and not someone who is just a normal person, because that would be very, very bad. Now, this covers how to kill vampires. It won't help you destroy and dismantle an entire princedom overnight, but it will help you deal with your average everyday vampire who's disorganized and not getting backing from a major political power. Now we move on to the vampires opposite, the werewolves. Werewolves are probably going to be the most deadly creature, or one of the most deadly creatures that a hunter may face. They heal most injuries very quickly. They almost always hunt in packs, and even their physical visage is known to cause hunters to go insane and mad. So what are werewolves' weaknesses? Well, the big one is going to be silver, but it's going to cause so much pain to the werewolf that it's likely to go into a berserking rage and kill most of the people who are attacking. You're gonna want to be prepared. One of the ways that you might want to try and take out werewolves is by using remote weapons, such as landmines or such, and having them filled with silver projectiles, such as silver ball bearings or shrapnel. Wounds caused by silver don't typically get regenerated by werewolves. If you know someone in Task Force Valkyrie, one of the Tier 3 conspiracies, you might want to get your hands on what is known as an equalizer grenade. What this does is essentially creates a flashing light trick that causes werewolves and other shape changers to be unable to leave their mortal form. So this grenade would be great against werewolves and maybe even demons, as demons have a demonic form that they can go into. Now, that being said, it does keep them in the form that they're in when it goes off. So if the werewolf has shifted up to one of their more powerful forms, you've now kept it in that more powerful form, and you might be screwed. Now, if you're a Tier 1 hunter and you don't have access to this equalizer grenade, you're going to have a lot more trouble. You're going to have to use long-range tactics and other such traps and tricks to keep werewolves away from you. The reason I say that is because werewolves can cover a lot of ground very quickly, but their main weapons are their claws and their teeth. So keep them at arm's length, even more than arm's length. Get a 10-foot pole, push them even further. Get a giant 25-foot pole and keep them even further. Get the world's most powerful sniper rifle and shoot them from a mile away. To clarify, this isn't going to help a hunter group clear out an entire protectorate. This is going to mainly deal with one werewolf that's a solitary werewolf, lone wolf, what have you, ghost wolf, or a pack that is not adhering to the don't let the herd know oath that werewolves have. Other than that, the game isn't expecting you to go out and kill every single werewolf or every single monster that exists. That's impossible and kind of a pipe dream. Now we talk about the mages. Now, if I'm talking about Mage the Awakening, there is a little bit of an issue with hunters hunting them. That issue being that most of the magic mages do in Mage the Awakening can't be remembered by normal mortals. In order to remember that a mage did magic, you need to have a supernatural merit. Now, a lot of the Tier 3 conspiracies do give supernatural merits to their hunters, and in the form of endowments. For instance, the Lucifuge are able to perform demonic rituals. Hunters would have to know that this person is doing something magical, or at least believe that this person's doing something magical. Even if they can't understand supernal magic, they might be like, this person's doing something magical. They've gone from being the bottom of the barrel to the top of the pyramid in 2 seconds flat. Why is that? Your mileage as a storyteller or a player might differ in that, and honestly, it's up to you individually to come up with a reason, if you want to, that a hunter might be hunting a mage. You might even choose not to do it at all, which is perfectly fine. So, what can a hunter do to try and identify a mage? Well, they can use the identification mental tactic. This is essentially staking out this individual and seeing if they're either a monster or a normal human being. Now, there is no rule for if this person is a mage and can use the ability quiescence to hide their magic. Well, quiescence is an ability, it's just how magic works in the system. But effectively, your hunter would probably use identification and be like, yes, this person could only have done this if they used magic. And that way we've got down here the roll, which is going to be intelligence plus occult versus the manipulation, subterfuge, and potency of the character. And then there are a bunch of other things like collecting evidence, tailing the target, and doing research. Now, hunters are mundane. They're not magical beings. So if they're hunting a mage, the mage isn't necessarily going to know unless they're being very observant, because their peripheral mage sight doesn't detect mundane attempts to track down the person. Again, we're looking at this from a hunter perspective in hunting down a mage, not in a mage's perspective of trying to avoid getting hunted. The stream name here is Hunter the Vigil, not Mage the Awakening. Now, the thing about hunters that people tend to forget is that even though they have these conspiracies and compacts that are dedicated to certain types of supernatural creatures or ways of operating, it doesn't mean that they're not still human. If they see someone being abused by some sort of supernatural creature, they're going to interact and interfere in some way, maybe even mediate if the creature is up for that. But, so for this instance, I was like, maybe the Council of Bones are investigating something and find out that there is a mage that is involved. Maybe it's a mage that's a necromancer or something. They have the ability to command ghosts, and maybe they can use this power to effectively fight the mage, and fight on similar terms. So what this power does is allows you to basically command a ghost to attack a target if you want. It's a pretty easy ability to cast. It's only versus resistance. I don't think it's going to get you a rank 3 or above ghost typically. It might be very difficult, but it's not impossible, I'd say. One thing that I just realized is that mages, when they use their powers, provoke paradox, and when there are normal people around, it provokes it even more. So a hunter, even if they're a hunter who is a sleepwalker, who has a supernatural merit or ability to use magic, they might still have normal mortals with them who aren't sleepwalkers. Usually the foot soldiers of your conspiracy or compact, or if you're playing in tier 1, maybe only one of you has a supernatural merit. But unknowingly, that's actually beneficial for the hunters to have these people who don't know about magic. Additionally, so long as the scene doesn't end, these people will be aware of magic happening. It doesn't have the not knowing about magic doesn't happen until the end of the scene, or until the magic has been removed from the area. So if they're probably in a fight with someone, they're going to remember that they're casting spells until the scene ends, and then they're like, man, that guy had a flamethrower. How did he have a flamethrower on him? Now that I've successfully alienated the Mage the Awakening players, let's move on to Promethean the Created. Now, normally Prometheans, as depicted in Promethean the Created, are very nice people, but they cause disquiet in mortals, which causes them to get violent and try and kill them. Now, as far as a hunter game goes, hey, it's beneficial. Your monster's making you want to kill them. Now, even though Prometheans do want to become human, that doesn't mean that they can't be antagonists as well. Maybe they're going about becoming human in a terrible way for actual humans. Or it could be that you're going up against one of the Prometheans that start using flux and aren't trying to appear human. Instead, they're trying to appear as monstrous as possible. Now, killing a Promethean is relatively easy. I already mentioned that immolation is a tactic that I would use for Promethean, and it makes sense. Let's say your hunters are trying to remove disquiet because maybe it's causing them to behave erratically or not logically at all. What they could use is this social tactic called freeing the mind. So the requirements for this tactic are that the target is suffering a mental or social effect imposed by a supernatural power or phenomenon. So I would say disquiet counts for that. Now, it's an extended roll against a person who is affected by disquiet or a similar mind control or mind affecting ability. I don't see here a duration for how long this takes, but we can say this is probably something that could take several minutes maybe to be done, or even a few hours depending. Now, if this was a simple effect, such as a single tilt or a condition, it would go away pretty quickly. But for disquiet, I believe it's a persistent condition, so it would only be suppressed for the rest of the current scene. So maybe the hunters who are all gathered together see the creature, one of them gets affected by disquiet and is like, no, we're going to go after this creature, I have to kill it, blah, blah, blah. And all the hunters are like, hey, step back, we need to make sure that you don't go crazy, and start talking to the person and calming them down. And so for the scene, that person no longer has disquiet running through their mind, but it's going to come back eventually, and they're going to have to deal with the monster quickly in that regard. If you get the exceptional success, you will get rid of that condition, even if it's a permanent one. Now, I will say with Prometheans, look at it from the hunter perspective. This is a monster that not only is terrifying to humans mainly, but it causes humans to become bloodthirsty and commit acts of violence. So it's well within the reasoning of a hunter to want to kill a Promethean, even if that reasoning is to protect other people from being affected by disquiet. Now we look into changelings, which are another more sympathetic splat that you have to look at from the hunter perspective instead of from the changeling perspective. I have run a Changeling in the Lost game where there were hunters, and people were saying to me, how could you have hunters hunt changelings? Changelings are usually just trying to appear human and not do anything. And I said, well, these hunters weren't hunting changelings entirely. They were also hunting hobgoblins and huntsmen and other types of changeling-based antagonists. And honestly, from a hunter perspective, they can't really tell the difference between a changeling or a hobgoblin. They're both weak to iron and cold iron, and they both sort of have this mask that appears over them unless you're in the hedge. And so it was a big deal where the hunters weren't sure if these changelings were actually the people they said they were, or the fetches were the people they said they were. Fetches being the people who take over the mortal life of a changeling when the changeling is taken by the true fate. Usually a fetch is like a bundle of string and cobbled together straw that takes on the likeness of a person but isn't actually a person. I'm not going to go more into this. I mean, changelings' weakness is iron and cold iron. It can bypass a lot of their supernatural defenses, and it can keep them imprisoned. That's something that all changelings have in common. Cold iron itself, which is sort of this nebulous term used for sort of like a natural iron weapon or unworked iron weapon, it can be used to actually cause aggravated damage to them. So if you're a hunter and you're hunting hobgoblins or changelings, you want to keep them in an iron cage because that keeps them from escaping. It keeps them from using any of their powers, at least outside of the cage. If it's inside the cage, you're probably going to have some problems. Now, if you can tell, I am going down the list of each Chronicles game line by line: Vampire, Werewolf, Mage, Promethean, Changeling. The next one would be Hunter. However, Hunters actually do have their own antagonists that were Hunters at one point, sometimes. Essentially, they're called Slashers, and what they are typically are humans, hunters often, who reached integrity 0 and essentially became serial killers. So these aren't a real world depiction of serial killers. These are horror movie type serial killers, like your Jason Voorhees, your Freddy Kruegers and such. So slashers as a term isn't really a term for in-game use, I believe. Sometimes it could be, depending on how your storyteller rolls with it. But from my opinion, it's more of an out-of-game term for a person who is killing people in a serial killer type fashion, but more in line with like the horror movie type serial killers or slashers. They come in two types, specifically. One is the Ripper, which is still mortal. So it's kind of like your Ghostface or your Hannibal Lecter type serial killer. They're not going to be too crazy as far as how they're using their abilities. They don't have magical abilities at all. They could be considered a normal person, but with a little bit of an extra kick to them. But then you have the Scourge, which is considered sort of like a urban legend, a creature or monster. And I believe the Scourges actually can have potency, which represents them being this sort of supernatural killer. So not only do you have Ripper and Scourge, but you also have Undertakings, which are sort of like your clan type from Vampire the Requiem, or your Mummy Decree from Mummy the Curse. Slashers themselves have various different ones. Usually it's one sort of category of slasher, and then it broken down into two different types, the Ripper type and the Scourge type. So let's talk about the Avenger. So the Avenger is not a superhero like in Marvel, or a British spy like in the British television show The Avengers. What they are people who believe that they've been done wrong and want to seek vengeance. At first, maybe a few individuals specifically involved with that, but then it gradually balloons and snowballs into more and more people. So the Avenger has a tell, which is basically their justification that they live by. It's their calling card or a particular form of execution that basically says they were the one who committed the crime. Additionally, they have a talent. This is something that is sort of like their benefit, for lack of a better term. And in this case, a defender's defense does not get penalized by anything and is always applied at full defense, except for when defense is ignored. Additionally, they have a frailty, and this frailty, of course, is mission focus, which means that they must pursue vengeance no matter what, and if they try to not do it, they have to roll a resolve plus composure, or be forced to pursue their prey even if it puts them in harm's way. So how might the hunters try and deal with this slasher? Well, they might try to set up a lure for the slasher in the form of someone that the slasher will attack based on their vengeance that they have, their calling card as well. And so now the slasher has to go through maybe a few hazards to get to that person, which weakens them and makes them easier to deal with. Now this is a person, so maybe you group up and try and take them out, but remember, they're applying their defense against all attacks, no matter what. Their full defense, even if they're attacked by multiple people. So having a large group isn't going to help as much. It's still a sheer number of fire versus one individual, though, so maybe this slasher will be taken out, but it's still going to take a long time. Move on to the Avenger Scourge version, which is called the Legend, which are essentially serial killers that are wrapped around in a urban legend, as it were, in that they only kill due to their story. Like, so if they only kill like redheads, they're going to kill redheads. They're not going to deviate from that story. Now we'll go into a little bit about this, but they're basically supernatural in some way, and you'll see that when we go through it. I did run a slasher that was an Avenger at one point, and the reason I did it was because I want to have a story about a vampire hunter who stopped hunting vampires because they thought that they should be killing goth people instead, because goth people are always vampires or something crazy like that. And that's how I ran the Avenger. This was a person who was killing vampires because they killed one of their family members. So they were like, I must kill vampires, but got to the point where they couldn't tell the difference between a vampire and a normal person. So the tell that the legends have are basically the story that is told about them. The tell basically lays out how this slasher works and what ways you can do, what things you can do to manipulate them, such as their weakness, their desired prey, or the location they're bound to. So this stops this slasher from being able to do things outside of their story and to sort of improvise. So one of the bonuses for playing as a legend is the live-in legend talent. Basically what this means is when a character fulfills one of the tenets of the Avenger's rules, the Avenger gets a bonus. They have to roll for it, but they still get that bonus. So for instance, if it says only attacks people who were sleeping in this one hotel room, the slasher would get a bonus if one of the characters decides to sleep in that room. Additionally, though, it gets the frailty narrative chains, which means that basically characters investigating the Scourge's tell get exceptional successes on 3s instead of 5. And it means that the legend is sort of bound to this narrative that they're stuck in. So as you can see, slashers are really interesting, and they have a lot of built-in weaknesses that your players can exploit. To Geists. Now, Geists are usually just rank 3 or rank 4 ghosts that no longer have their identity and are sort of like have no name, they can't remember their history, and oftentimes they'll merge with people who have died and create what is known as a bound or sin eater, depending. I'm going to call a Geist combined with a normal person a sin eater instead of just the generic term bound, just for simplicity's sake. In terms of in-game terms, sin eaters are specifically like the good guys, I think. They're trying to help ghosts and everything, but bound as antagonists are possible because they might exploit ghosts for personal gain and such. So there is precedent for sin eaters to be antagonists or bound to be antagonists. So let's just go directly to it. How do you kill a sin eater? Well, first off, you need to find out how the sin eater died, and then make sure to kill them in a manner that is similar to the way they died. That can be easy for something like, say, someone getting shot in the back, more difficult for someone who died of cancer. Additionally, if you're just looking to keep killing the Sin Eater to the point where their Geist will no longer bring them back, you essentially have to find out what the Geist's Bane is, which might be very difficult depending on if you know what the Geist actually is. You probably don't, because unless the Geist unleashes, and then you have a little bit of a physical description that you might be able to work around. But essentially, harming the Sin Eater with the Bane of the Geist means that they can't be healed. They can't use their plasmic healing to actually recover. So how do you deal with a Sin Eater? Well, honestly, it's pretty much a war of attrition as far as I can tell from their end. But I'll like to highlight the Council of Bones here, because they are pretty damn good at dealing with ghosts. The Orc Shield is an ability that is generally useful against ghosts. Essentially, it's going to protect against any Numina or Dread powers that deal with death or a hunter's soul, and it provokes a clash of wills. I'd argue, hey, if it was my game, and you're using the Haunt against a hunter that's using this ability, it probably is going to be affected by this. Honestly, from what I've seen of Geist the Sin Eater, I think it would be more beneficial to have them as social antagonists or rivals than to have them as physical ones. Trying to kill them is very difficult, and you're mostly basically trying to fight the Geist itself or other ghosts that are manifested in the area, and that's less fighting the Sin Eater, more just fighting ghosts in general. You can't exorcise a Sin Eater from their Geist, which is going to be a little bit of a hiccup, but there are probably some ways to get around that if you are clever enough. And we move from Geist the Sin Eater to Mummy the Cursed, where we face off against the Immortal Arisen, which are impossible to kill. Well, maybe if you know what to do. So as I said before, mummies are weak to fire. They'll take aggravated damage from it, so immolation is a good tactic to have. However, they have the ability to resurrect multiple times. They can resurrect to their body if it hasn't been burned completely, or they can resurrect to any one of their invested cultists, which has a maximum number of about 100 cultists. And even then, they can resurrect to any one of their canopic jars. Essentially, they remove 4 of their organs, and they can resurrect to one of those organs that then grows back their body. So I've said essentially what you need to do. You need to kill off cultists, you need to destroy their canopic jars, and you need to make sure that after doing so, they don't invest any more cultists with their power, and that they themselves are burnt alive. But what if I told you there might be an easier way to do this? In fact, hunters have the tactic of harvest, which allows them to collect samples from monsters that they have held. So this needs to be a little bit more of a storyteller-approved thing, but honestly, I think that the harvest tactic would be really good for draining an enemy of any special power they have. For instance, essence from a spirit or a ghost, or in the case of, say, a mummy, their Sikhem. And a vampire might be their Vitae, but not their blood potency, unless there's some weird way to do that that I'm just not thinking of. But I like the idea of being able to drain a mummy of their Sikhem, because that's what a lot of immortals want to do. They want to take the Sikhem from the mummy and use it for their own ends. So I think it's well within the theme. And so if a hunter is doing this, hunter's able to inject the mummy. Hopefully it's a mummy that is either really bad at rolling or at a little bit lower to their Sikhem value than they should be. And what this would do would be effectively getting them to Sikhem 0 would put them back into their dormancy and make it easy for the player characters or the hunters to just disable the mummy. They're not going to be able to kill it, because if they're dealing with the judges here, and the judges of mummies want to make sure that their mummies resurrect. So you're just going to have to deal with the fact that you're going to have this shriveled old corpse sitting in a museum somewhere, or in a lockbox in your conspiracy or your compact's basement, and hopefully no one comes looking for it. So now we move on from mummies to demons, and demons are probably the most interesting thing that you're going to have to deal with, especially if they're god machine demons, because you don't have to kill them, you just have to let the god machine deal with them for you. So demons are the type of antagonists that you don't want to deal with physically. Their powers are very potent, especially against mortals, and their demonic form is quite dangerous to go toe-to-toe with. But honestly, there's not one universal way to deal with them as far as a ban or a bane goes. However, they do have one Achilles heel, and that's their cover. The main thing that keeps a demon safe is that no one knows where they are or who they are. That's where expose comes in. Essentially, the hunters are going to expose the demon as a demon, or threaten to expose the demon as a demon if demands aren't met. So maybe this is a way that you can protect someone who's about to sign a deal with a demon. You say, demon, don't sign that deal with this person, or else I am going to expose you for what you are. And now, demon's cover is very much based off of if they can maintain it. Any exposure really starts to deteriorate it, and they become less and less human-like. So with this, you give them the notoriety condition. If I go down here, yeah, notoriety condition, or you can do the leverage condition. Now, honestly, I think that with the notoriety condition, you're essentially making the demon even more so a target for the god machine, and this is probably your best bet at getting a demon to lay off of someone. Is it going to kill them? Possibly. But really, what you want to do is you want to protect whoever it is that the demon is interacting with, or to stop them from doing something that you find bad. It should be noted, though, if the god machine doesn't deal with this demon and that they survive, you're probably going to be screwed. Similarly to any of the other splats, if you don't kill them or deal with them immediately, they're probably going to try and screw you over later. So Beasts and Beasts the Primordial are an interesting conundrum. They live between two worlds, the material world and the dream world, or the primordial dreaming. So how are you going to fight beasts? Well, you're probably going to fight them in your dream, sort of like having to fight Freddy Krueger or something like that. That seems to be something that I don't think hunters are able to do baseline. Probably the best way to deal with a beast, though, is to destroy its lair, its heart chamber in the center of its lair. And this tactic is very good at doing so. Now see, you have to go into the primordial dreaming to do this, but you could probably get a ride with a hero who's looking to create a posse to kill beasts, horror, and such. So I propose using the sweep tactic to help with that. Essentially what this is going to allow you to do is to try and bypass the defenses of the lair. Now, it's because the horror lives there, they're going to be using a wits plus stealth plus potency roll to basically stop you from doing this. If you are able to get this tactic off, though, you are probably going to be able to locate the main chamber of this lair and probably get into a better situation where you can take it down with some explosive charges or something. And if you do that, you kill the beast. So now we get to the last bit where we talk about Deviant the Renegade, and I'm going to probably gloss over it a little bit, but essentially Deviants are all pretty unique. They all have various different downsides to their powers and called scars, and they have various things that they can do. There is no unified thing about deviants that a hunter themselves could probably use to their benefit when fighting them, aside from the fact that there is a conspiracy that created or is researching said deviant. So, as I said before, there are conspiracies in Hunter the Vigil, but these are different conspiracies than the conspiracies that monitor or create deviants. You can't really equate the two. Though it is highly likely that the Chiron group, one of these conspiracies, probably has a few deviants that they've created over time. Likely the main thing that you're going to use against deviants is the expose tactic that I talked about with demons, though there's probably also capture, lore, and all those other different tactics that you can use as well, especially if your plan is to give the deviant back to the organization that created it in the first place. That being said, deviants are very much unique in every situation because they're so customizable, and the conspiracies that are after them are probably more dangerous than the deviant themselves, and you'd likely have the hunter groups thinking that maybe the deviants are a little bit more sympathetic than the conspiracy because they didn't choose to become a deviant unless they did. If the deviant, however, is malicious, your best bet probably is going to be hoping that bullets actually work on it. Thank you so much for being here with me and going through this little exercise that I had for Beginner's Guide. Please let me know what you thought about it in the messages below. I loved trying to come up with ways for hunters to interact with the other game lines and how they are a little bit more effective than you might think when they go up against full-on supernatural creatures that have their own game lines and such. I appreciate any comments you have. Definitely I'll be in the messages below responding to them if you have any. That being said, what do you think? Do you think your hunter group might be able to take on a vampire, a werewolf, a mage, or any of the other game lines out there? I was really surprised when I was doing this research for this episode that Geist the Sin Eater seemed to be one of the splats that I had the hardest time coming up with a reason for hunters to be able to kill them. That and Beast the Primordial, essentially, because at the end of the day, you really just have to hope that combat-wise that you're going to be effective. If you're not, you're really just sort of like relying on your anti-ghost abilities that you might have, like some sort of endowments or tactics. and even then it's not really directly effective against a Sin Eater. It's more directly effective against a lone Geist or ghost instead. One of the things that surprised me about hunters is just how potent they are once you get to the tier 3 level. And that's why I kept bringing them up. Like, if I brought up any of the endowments, it was because I felt they were very good, essentially, at taking on certain supernatural creatures. For instance, that grenade that stops werewolves from being able to transform, that is pretty potent. I had one of the armory weapons that they have is something called etheric rounds, I believe, and they're useful for taking on ephemeral entities, mainly ghosts. And I had a hunter group in one of my games actually take out a Moros mage who was hanging around in Twilight because they were using etheric rounds and some sort of eyeglasses that allowed them to see beings in Twilight. And the Moros mage was just so surprised by that. They were like, oh my god, I can't believe that's happening. And it was awesome. It felt very visceral. It felt like it was something that would happen within the narrative of the game, and was fun to do. One of my main hopes with Hunter the Vigil is that a lot of people start writing for more and more on the Storyteller's Vault. In particular, I feel like Hunter the Vigil could really use some extra conspiracies to work with. And as far as I can tell, there isn't much of a benefit other than the status for working for the compacts, and I feel like they could use something similar to endowments, maybe additional equipment and such. Something about the compacts that I didn't really cover was that when your status increases, you actually get additional benefits, such as these status improvements that you get with the Network Zero faction. You get free skill specialties. The higher rank you get in here, you get more contacts, and you can additionally get a safe house, which is pretty cool. So if there were something that I'd like to see a little bit more of, maybe it's these compacts and conspiracies, as well as endowments. Tactics are also something that could be fleshed out a little bit more, and if you're someone who likes the Storyteller Vault, or does do work on the Storyteller Vault, that might be 3 areas you want to take a look at. I especially feel like the social tactics are a little bit not up there as far as what variety you could have, mainly because a lot of the mental tactics seem to cover that. For instance, like if you're trying to profile someone, that's under mental tactics, whereas maybe you're trying to socialize at a club or at a party and you're trying to track down, like, is this guy actually a vampire or not? Is he drinking his wine, or is he drinking something that's not wine? There's a lot of this like espionage aspect to Hunter that isn't in the book itself in the same way that it might be in, say, something like Demon the Descent, but honestly, I could definitely see hunters acting in various different capacities. I mean, there are different hunter groups already. I just mentioned Network Zero being one, and that's the more technological hunters. One of my favorite groups actually is the Network Zero one, but Nine Star is also there, but Nine Star is very local to I believe Hong Kong. They are hunters that mainly focus on hunting slashers, which isn't to say they don't hunt other supernatural creatures as well. Then there is like the Long Night, the Union, all those types of groups. And when you're in a hunter cell, like, you can have these compacts all working together in sort of like a unified task force, similar with conspiracies, each one having their own little bit of political intrigue going on, because yes, this is a unified task force, but your players are more socialized within their own group and such. Now, if, as I was saying before about like the espionage stuff, Task Force Valkyrie seems like one that might be more likely to do espionage, maybe even the VASCU. I think we're probably well over time by now, or at least I hope so. I'm editing this right after this, so I'll know then. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for sticking around, and I hope you have a good one.